At the edge of a quiet forest outside Warsaw, trucks arrived before sunrise. Inside were prisoners from the city's most feared Nazi prison. Professors, journalists, priests, athletes, men who believed they were simply being transferred to another detention camp. They were even allowed to bring their personal belongings. But when the truck stopped in the depths of the Campinos forest, the prisoners began to notice something strange. The ground had already been disturbed. Long trenches cut through the soil. What they didn't know was that these pits had been dug for one purpose. And within a few years, the men responsible for this massacre would face judgment. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the attack was not only military. It was ideological. From the very beginning, Nazi leadership believed Poland could never be controlled as long as its educated class remained alive. Professors, priests, politicians, writers, teachers, these were the people who shaped the nation's identity. If they were removed, the rest of the population would be easier to dominate. So the German occupation authorities began a calculated campaign known as the destruction of the Polish intelligentsia. Across the country, thousands of influential civilians were quietly arrested. University professors were taken from lecture halls. Catholic priests were pulled from their parishes. Writers, lawyers, judges, artists, and journalists disappeared into prisons. Many of them were transported to one place in Warsaw that quickly gained a reputation for terror, Palmiry prison. Inside its walls, prisoners lived in constant uncertainty. Interrogations were brutal, but the true fear came from something else: the sudden lists of names. At any moment, guards could enter a cell block and call out dozens of prisoners. Those selected were told they were being transferred to another prison, or sometimes to a labor camp. The instructions sounded routine. Gather your belongings. Prepare for transport. The prisoners were even allowed to bring suitcases and personal items, a detail carefully designed to make the story believable. But the destination was never another prison. Instead, trucks carried them west of Warsaw into the dense wilderness of the Campinos forest. There, hidden among the tall pines and thick undergrowth, the German SS had chosen a remote clearing that would soon become one of the most secret killing grounds in occupied Poland. The executions were organized with chilling precision. Before each transport arrived, large burial pits were dug deep into the sandy forest soil. Sometimes the trenches stretched nearly 30 meters long. And when the trucks finally arrived from Warsaw, the victims would be marched toward those pits, still believing they were simply being transferred somewhere else. The truth would only become clear in the final moments. The clearing in the Campinos forest was deliberately chosen for one reason: silence. Thick trees surrounded the area, blocking the view from nearby roads. The sandy soil made digging easier, and the isolation meant that gunshots would rarely carry far enough to raise alarm. By the time the prison trucks arrived, the graves were already waiting. The prisoners were ordered out and lined up beside the forest path. German guards moved quickly, shouting commands and separating the group into smaller lines. Some victims still believed they were about to board another transport, but others had begun to notice the pits. Long trenches cut into the earth, freshly turned soil, and armed SS men standing along the edges. Only then did the terrible truth begin to emerge. The prisoners were marched toward the edge of the graves. Each group was positioned so that their backs faced the execution squad. Then, one by one, they were shot in the back of the head. The process was designed for speed. Victims collapsed directly into the pits below, where the next line of prisoners would soon follow. In many cases, the executions continued until the trench was filled with bodies. The killings were not chaotic. They were methodical. German officials carefully organized transport schedules from Warsaw prisons. The executions themselves were carried out by SS and police units assigned specifically to these operations. To prevent panic or resistance, the deception was maintained until the very end. Prisoners were often told they were being relocated to work camps. That is why they were allowed to carry luggage or personal belongings when they left their cells. Suitcases, coats, family photographs. Small pieces of ordinary life that many believed they would soon need again. After the executions, the graves were quickly covered with layers of sand and forest debris. Pine branches and moss were spread across the soil to disguise the disturbed ground. Sometimes young trees were planted over the burial sites to make the clearing appear untouched. From the outside, nothing about the forest looked unusual. But beneath the quiet canopy of trees, hundreds of victims had already been buried. And the executions continued. Transport after transport arrived from Warsaw. Politicians, teachers, religious leaders, members of the resistance. even well-known public figures. By the time the killing campaign slowed in 1941, approximately 1,700 people had been murdered in this forest alone. Yet the Nazis believed the secret of Palmiry would remain hidden forever. Behind every transport that entered the Campinos forest was a list of names. To the German authorities, these names represented a problem to be eliminated. But in reality, they were the very people who had helped shape Polish society. Among the victims were university professors who had spent their lives teaching the next generation. There were journalists who had written about politics and culture in Warsaw's newspapers. Catholic priests who had guided their communities for decades. Judges, lawyers, teachers, and artists. Men whose influence extended far beyond their prison cells. One of the most famous victims was Janusz Kusowczynski, a national hero in Poland. Years earlier, Kusowczynski had become one of the country's greatest athletes. At the 1932 Olympic Games in Los Angeles, he won the gold medal in the 10,000-meter race, becoming a symbol of national pride. But when Germany invaded Poland, Kusowczynski did not flee. Instead, he joined the underground resistance in Warsaw, helping transport weapons and deliver messages for the Polish army. Eventually he was arrested by the Gestapo and sent to Pawiak prison. Like so many others, he was later placed on a transport list. On a June morning in 1940, the Olympic champion was taken from his cell and loaded onto one of the trucks heading toward the forest. Not long afterward, he was executed at Palmiry. His story reflected the broader purpose behind the massacre. The Nazis were not simply killing prisoners. They were systematically removing the individuals who inspired, organized, and represented Polish national identity. By eliminating teachers, leaders, and cultural figures, the occupation authorities hoped to weaken the country's ability to resist. It was a strategy meant to destroy a nation without destroying its population entirely. But despite the secrecy surrounding Palmiry, not everyone remained unaware of what was happening inside the forest. And some people quietly began to take extraordinary risks to make sure the truth would one day be discovered. Although the Nazis chose the Campinos forest for its isolation, the area was not completely empty. Foresters worked throughout the region, maintaining the woods and monitoring the land. Over time, some of them began to notice unusual activity. Trucks arriving deep in the forest. German police units guarding remote clearings. Fresh soil appearing in places where the ground had recently been undisturbed. One of the men who observed these changes was a Polish forester named Adam Habanski. He understood the danger immediately. Anyone caught investigating German operations could be arrested or executed on the spot. Yet Habanski and a few others quietly began to study the areas where the transport stopped. Whenever possible, they secretly marked the locations of the burial pits. Sometimes they scratched small signs into nearby trees. Other times they memorized the exact positions of the clearings. Their goal was simple but incredibly risky. If the war ever ended, someone would need to know where the victims were buried. And because of their courage, the secret of Palmiry would not remain hidden forever. When World War II finally ended in 1945, the forests around Warsaw were quiet again. But beneath the trees of Palmiry lay a secret that many feared might never be fully uncovered. That is when the information gathered by local foresters became invaluable. Guided by the markings and observations recorded during the occupation, Polish investigators began searching the areas deep inside the Campinos forest where the executions had taken place. What they discovered confirmed the worst fears. Mass graves. One after another, the burial pits were opened. Inside them were the remains of hundreds of victims who had vanished from Warsaw prisons years earlier. Many were still buried with the personal items they had been allowed to bring with them: watches, documents, pieces of clothing. Evidence of the deception that had led them into the forest. In total, investigators recovered the remains of approximately 1,700 people executed at Palmiry. But uncovering the graves was only the beginning. The next question was whether those responsible for the massacre would ever face justice. After the war, investigators began building cases against the German officials responsible for the terror in occupied Poland. Many of the orders that led to the Palmiry executions traced back to senior Nazi administrators governing the Warsaw district. Among them was Ludwig Fischer, the German governor of Warsaw during the occupation. His administration oversaw the campaign of arrests and executions that targeted Poland's political and intellectual leadership. Another notorious figure connected to the repression in Warsaw was Joseph Mazinger, often called the Butcher of Warsaw. As evidence from prisons, documents, and mass graves accumulated, several of these men were eventually brought before war crimes tribunals. Some were executed. Others spent the rest of their lives imprisoned. For the victims buried in Palmiry, justice had come slowly. But it had come. Today, the clearing in the Campinos forest is no longer a place of secrecy. It is the site of the Palmiry Cemetery and Memorial, where rows of white crosses mark the resting place of many of the victims who were once buried in hidden graves. The forest is quiet again. But beneath those trees lies a reminder of what happens when a regime tries to erase a nation by eliminating its voice. And why the stories of Palmiry must never be forgotten.